But first tonight, what if your next-door neighbor suddenly went dangerously insane and started holding people hostage in his house? In Canada, took a dramatic move toward legitimately dangerous authoritarianism. Here's just one measure of it. On Monday, the country's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, outlined his government's new corona regulations. Canadians hoping to return to their country must be tested before and after takeoff, he said. Quote, if your test results come back positive, you'll need to immediately quarantine in designated government facilities. This is not optional. Now, when this happens in other countries, and it does, we call those facilities internment camps. But because this is Canada we're talking about, a place we assume is passive and polite and Anglo to the point of parody, no one thinks to use that term. In fact, no one thinks about it at all. Trudeau's internment policy has been in place since last month. And as far as we can tell, no major U.S. network has even mentioned it. And neither has our State Department, which ordinarily seems to exist to make unhappy noises about human rights violations around the world. But not a word about Canada. Suddenly, Canada is a flagrant violator of the most basic human rights. Fail a COVID test and they will lock you up without trial, and go ahead and try to disobey. According to the Canadian government, anyone who attempts to avoid these rules, detention in a government internment facility, for example, could face a $1 million fine and 3 years in prison. This is Justin Trudeau's Canada. In Canada, where everything has a euphemism, those cells are referred to as approved quarantine hotels. What are they like? Well, as noted, they're internment cells. What do you think they're like? There are shortages of food and water. You could be sexually assaulted as you're held in one. Listen to a member of the Canadian Parliament explain what they're like.
The Liberals instituted a federal hotel quarantine requirement for those entering Canada. We have heard reports that it is taking hours to get through to book these hotels, dietary restrictions are not being met, and food and water is not always readily available. That's in addition to this program continuing after reports of sexual assault. This is mind-boggling.
According to a report in the Post-Millennial, the doors in many of the internment facilities don't lock. Detainees have no way to protect themselves while they sleep, hence the sexual assault. They also don't have access to adequate medical care. In one case, Canadian authorities detained a man with diabetes called Ray Truesdale. What was Truesdale's crime? Well, it was flying from Tennessee to Toronto on a business trip. As he waited in confinement for his corona test results, his jailers forgot to feed Truesdale for more than 24 hours. Ultimately, Truesdale left his cell and went downstairs in search of something to eat. And there he found others who were being held without food. They were screaming, he said. In the end, Canadian authorities informed Truesdale that his coronavirus sample had been damaged somehow, so he had to remain in internment. Or consider Mitch Beaulieu, a Canadian who landed in Calgary after a business trip to Florida. He told Canadian television that the experience was very much like a kidnapping. He was put, quote, in a black van with tinted windows and taken to an undisclosed location. Where am I going, he asked. Why am I going there? The response, we'll tell you everything when you get there. He thought it was a prank. He thought it had to be, but it wasn't a prank. Quote, I got out there and there was plastic all over, people walking around in hazmat suits. It was like jail, pretty much. Yeah, just don't call it jail. And that's an order directly from Canadian state media. This fall, the CBC, Canadian state media, ran a story with this headline. Prime Minister health officials warn Canadians against believing COVID-19 internment camps disinformation. Warn them against believing. Sound familiar? That claim, that conspiracy theory, said CBC, that the federal government is preparing to forcibly intern Canadians is patently false. The CBC assured Canadians the government was preparing, quote, voluntary quarantine sites. Yeah, voluntary in the sense of being mandatory, which is what they are. They're mandatory. Weirdly, too, and you may recognize this as well, at the same moment they're clamping down on travel by their own citizens, the Canadian government has announced plans to admit 400,000 new permanent residents from other countries over the next 8 months. None of those people, those immigrants from the third world, will be forcibly quarantined in Canada. We're not calling for them to be, but it's interesting, the difference. They won't be arrested. In fact, they'll be rewarded because they're not citizens. Only the citizens are punished. Back in November, Justin Trudeau admitted what's going on here. It's not about coronavirus, stopping the virus, saving lives. No. This pandemic, he said, is an opportunity to permanently change Western civilization.
This pandemic has provided an opportunity for a reset. This is our chance to accelerate our pre-pandemic efforts to reimagine economic systems that actually address global challenges like extreme poverty, inequality, and climate change.
At a forum hosted by the World Economic Forum in mid-November, John Kerry, our new climate czar, laid it out. We're at the dawn of an extremely exciting time. It's been a sad time for most people. But for power-mad leaders hoping to eliminate centuries of constitutional restraints on their own ambitions, it is indeed an exciting time. We don't need internment cells here because, unlike Canada, we have the vaccine and we're distributing it to tens of millions of people. And once you're vaccinated, you can live normally. That's the whole point of getting vaccinated. But then you wonder, if that's true, why are Joe Biden and Kamala Harris still wearing their silly little obedience masks everywhere they go? They've been vaccinated. So is everyone around them. So why the masks? Why the restrictions? What exactly is going on here? We know it's not science. We know that for certain. According to the CDC, once you are vaccinated, of course, you don't need a mask anymore.
We can kind of almost see the end. We're vaccinating so very fast. Our data from the CDC today suggests, that vaccinated people do not carry the virus, don't get sick, and that it's not just in the clinical trials, but it's also in real-world data.